This is a review of one of my Glocks for a user on YouTube, BS Trippy. This is one of my custom Glocks that I have built for myself. Before I discuss about modifications and things I did to achieve this build, I'm just going to quickly go over the parts that I have used. Okay, so looking at the slide itself, this is a garter slide, and I use a Duracoat Magpul FDE tan, and I airbrush this myself. In terms of the sights, these are the Guns Modify night sights. They're actually pretty good for the price. The best ones I have ever used is actually the ones by 9Ball, which look something like this. However, for the $100 price tag for the 9Ball ones, they're a bit pricey for my budget. So for this Glock, I used the Guns Modify instead. Internally, this is a garter steel outer barrel. The inner barrel is a PDI 6.1 inner barrel with a A+ Reaps hop-up rubber. The recoil rod itself is a shooter's design. This is the silver one. I feel that the shooter's design recoil rod is the best one I've ever experienced and used. It's much better than the garter because as you push the spring back, the spring is able to compress and expand very smoothly. There's no resistance at all. In the slide components, I'm using a new Guns Modify blowback unit with the AIRSOFT Surgeon's air nozzle. Looking at the bottom part of the gun, the frame itself is also made by garter. I have stippled this myself over on this side where I rest my thumb, and also on the grip. This is also the stock Tokyo Marui, the grip that goes along here. I've also stippled along here as well, where I usually rest the web of my hand. Looking at the exterior of the frame, this is a garter lock. This is a garter slide catch, a garter magazine catch, and over here is a Guns Modify adjustable trigger. The stirrup over here that connects the trigger to the rear of the chassis, this is made by garter. The internal components of the gun, the main guts of the gun, I am using a Guns Modify Zero Hammer version 3, and I will explain why I use this hammer as opposed to the ones I used before. The valve knocker, this connector, and the sear itself is made by AIP. They're all steel components. I pretty much purchased the AIP steel hammer trigger set, and I used the entire set except for the hammer. Okay, the Guns Modify Zero Hammer is compatible with the AIP sear that I use in this build. Okay, now I'm going to quickly go over some modifications. Before you do any modifications to your Glock, it's very, very important that you're aware of a few considerations. First thing is, why do you want to modify your Glock, and what do you want to achieve? The second thing you want to think about is, if you do the modifications and if you overdo the modifications, what are some of the consequences or the implications it has on the function of the gun? You pretty much have to know how the Glock works, how every single part works, every single little notch, especially on the blowback unit, and you need to think about, if you do modify a part of the gun, how will it affect the other features and the other functions of the gun. Okay, I will also talk about that as I go through some of the modifications. So for my purpose of modifying my Glock is so that it cycles as smooth as possible with minimal resistance, and also maintaining its reliability. So when I try to build my Glocks so that it cycles very smoothly, what I normally do is I remove everything in the rear chassis, hammer sear everything here, and all I do is I leave the front chassis and the rear chassis into the frame, and on the slide I take everything off, including the air nozzle, and all I leave is the blowback housing over there. The reason why I take off the air nozzle is to eliminate any variables that may cause the slide to cycle very poorly, and also if I remove the air nozzle, I'm able to look down the ejection port of the slide and see where there's any hindrance or any resistance. So after all the parts are removed, what I do is that I would put the slide onto the frame itself, and I would manually cycle it like this. I would listen and I would feel for any type of resistance at all. Okay, the most common resistance is when the lugs of the slide and also on the lower parts of the blowback unit rubs along the front and the rear chassis. So after hearing and after feeling all the resistance, I've noticed that because there are a lot of sharp corners on the slide and on the chassis, the slide does not cycle very smoothly. So what I did is that on both the front and the rear chassis, any sharp corners you see, okay, such as here, 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 any sharp corners, I rounded them off so that when the lugs of the slide runs across these channels over here, it runs very smoothly. Same thing with over here, and over here, and over here, and over here. Same principle applies to all the corners of the slide itself. I've only rounded off corners that I felt or that I heard any resistance. Okay, so that's the first thing that I did. The second thing is, with the Guns Modify housing itself, this hump over here is the one that actually engages and pushes down the hammer. Okay, a lot of the times the hump over here, it protrudes more than required, which is why when you rack the slide you feel a bit of a bump when it rides over the hammer. However, I would not suggest that you sand any of this part off, because if you sand just a tiny bit more than it's required, then it's not able to cock the hammer when the slide cycles. Now, instead, what I did is that this part over here, if the protrusion is too great or too profound, sometimes it would rub along here and here as well. So I sanded this part down and this part down a bit so that there's no rubbing from the BBU with this part. Second thing is, the hump on the blowback unit may also rub on the side of the hammer right over here when it's cocked. I know that for the Guns Modified version 2, version 1, this is much higher than the version 3, so that's why sometimes this rubs along with the hump on the BBU even when the hammer is cocked. The reason why I use the Guns Modify Zero hammer is because of this triangle piece over here. Traditionally, AIP and TMs, they use a bearing and it's circular. The reason why I opted to use this one is because it's more dynamic in nature, and I'll explain why. When the hammer is cocked, this piece over here, it's flat and it runs parallel with the slide of the gun, so that when the hammer is cocked, and even if you rack the slide, the protrusion on the BBU, it doesn't really touch this part. There's no resistance when the protrusion runs along here. However, if it's a ball bearing or a bearing itself where it's circular in nature, every time when the protrusion on the BBU runs along it, it will push it down. That's why sometimes when you rack the slide you feel the protrusion. So what I did is I opted to use the Guns Modify hammer instead, because I feel that that gave me the best results. Other modifications I did include the front chassis, it is very common for garter frames for the posts inside here to break because of the transfer of the force. When the slide returns the battery, the force is exerted onto the front chassis itself. The front chassis itself, the force is transferred onto the screw, and if this is the screw and if this is the casing, lateral movements of the screw will cause the plastic casing around to break. So what I did is, instead, I did not use a screw in the middle, and I JB welded the entire front chassis into the frame. So far, I put in thousands of rounds into this, and the front chassis is very, very sturdy, very, very solid, and has not come out yet. Now, the other thing to keep in mind of is, if you do any modifications, a lot of the times the slide and the frame itself, there's a lot of play, vertical play that goes like this. For me, you do not want too much play, but you also don't want it to be too tight. If there is too much play, the opening to the air nozzle here may not have a good seal with the gas route, which means that there's a potential for gas to leak. If it is too tight, then there might be too much resistance for the slide to cycle along the frame itself. So you kind of have to achieve a balance of it, okay? So that's why what I did is that when I glued in the front chassis to the frame, I made sure that the height of this is very important. The height of this is not too high and not too low. Now, for a lot of the garter slides, it's a hit and miss in terms of performance-wise and quality. And it's a hit and miss because of the height of the lugs in here. Because if the height of the lugs is too low, it means that the front and the rear chassis will be rubbing a lot against the slide itself because the slide is sitting too low. If the lugs are too high, then what happens is that the slide would sit higher, and you will affect the gas efficiency or the gas exchange from the magazine to the air nozzle. So that's why some of the garter slides are a hit and miss, and it really depends on the batch and the kind of slide that you get. The other modification I did was to the air nozzle itself. I built up the area around the air nozzle here, so it forms a much greater seal with the gas route on the magazine to prevent any gas leakage, and also to ensure that every time the gun cycles backwards, the blowback is very consistent. Second thing I did is that the O-ring on the piston head over here, I put a custom O-ring that's slightly larger so that it forms a tighter seal with the air nozzle here, again to prevent any air leakage. The other modifications I did was over here, this part on the slide. The reason why is because every time when the slide cycles, it rubs along the top of the outer barrel like that. And if you have a black outer barrel, the last thing you would want to see is the paint and all the wear marks coming off over here. So instead what I did is I smoothed this area out and I polished it so that it doesn't rub as much with the top of the outer barrel. The other thing that I did is over here on the underside of the slide and just slightly in the lugs, I remove some of the paint to also decrease the resistance. I use anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 grit sandpaper. I don't want to sand too much. Again, if you sand too much, then there's going to be a lot of play. So you always have to be mindful of the modifications that you're doing and the implications it has on the functions of the gun. The other thing is this part over here, the garter stirrup. Okay, when you pull the trigger, the stirrup goes back, and the stirrup is the thing that actually sits between the sear and also the hammer. When you pull it back, it releases the sear from the hammer, and as a result, the hammer will come forward. This bump over here, a lot of the times, it's really high, and if it's too high, it hits along here too much on the blowback housing. What you can do is you can sand this down slightly, okay, so that it minimizes any resistance. But however, I would not sand the hump on the actual stirrup itself, because if you sand it too much, the notch on the BBU right here will not be able to push this down completely, which means that the trigger is not able to reset and it will still sit between the sear and the hammer. Okay, so, and when that happens, it means that if you try to pull the trigger, you won't be able to. So that's also very important. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the gun back together, and we're just going to do a test fire of the gun. Here is my my compressor that I use to test my guns with. I can actually feel and hear that every shot is very consistent. The blowback is also very consistent itself. And the good thing about the adjustable trigger is that if you notice on a lot of stock Marui Glocks, you have to pull the trigger a lot before the shot is fired. So the adjustable guns modified trigger eliminates that pull that you need. If you do not want to purchase it, I do have another mod that I use, and what that is that it's a piece of spacer I put between the stirrup and the frame, so that when the trigger resets, it doesn't go all the way, it just comes halfway, so that it decreases the pull. Okay, so even if I manually cycle the slide over here, there is no resistance at all. The only thing I feel is actually the recoil spring that's being compressed, and that's it. Even when the hammer is forward and I pull the slide back, all it is that the hammer is cocked forward, sorry, is cocked backwards, and that's it. And after that, the gun is very smooth. You can feel it like this. There's no resistance at all. I don't feel any type of rubbing or anything. So there was another user that was asking me between a PGC slide and a shooter's design slide. The PGC slide is very, very smooth, and you don't really have to do any modifications because it's that great. Again, there's no resistance. What you're hearing right now is the spring being compressed along the spring guide, and as the slide is rubbing along the front and the rear chassis, there is no resistance at all. Okay, so I'm just going to do a test fire of the gun. Every shot very consistent again, because the gas efficiency has been improved. Here's on full auto. I'm going to do a stress test just to show you how smooth the gun is. And there you have it. If you have any questions about my Glock builds, any modifications, or any comments, please feel free to post them below, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions.